Wade Keller of The Torch also conducted an extensive interview with Moxley this week. Parts 1 and 2, he cut it up into 2 parts. They are up. They are free to listen to on the Torch website. Here's just some more thoughts on what Moxley had to say. He added some more color here to what he said with Jericho. And I know a lot of what Moxley said in this interview is going to read like sour grapes. It's going to come across as him just being a negative person. He's being vindictive. But he made it very clear. He went out of his way to say, I'm not trying to be negative. He doesn't view any of the interviews he's given as being negative for the sake of just being negative and bitching and complaining. He says that he is trying to shine a light on a very real problem that exists in this company. Nobody else is doing it publicly. He says, I have to take it upon myself to tell this story because nobody else is. Everybody else is afraid or they can't. They're under contract. And now I don't have to feel, that I can't. I'm liberated. I could do and say whatever I want. Who better to shine a light on it than somebody who was backstage and dealing with Vince McMahon in the trenches every single week for years, for 7 years. Over 7 years. So to me, it doesn't come across as sour grapes. It comes across as somebody who just got sick and tired of the BS and wants the world to know what really goes on there and why the talent and the writers, and by and large, and really, the writers do by and large, but the talent to a lesser degree, many times, bear the brunt of something that is not their fault. Now, one of the interesting stories he tells is the angle that never was with him and Mick Foley. You may remember there was a video that was shot in a hotel lobby. This would have been over WrestleMania, I believe WrestleMania 28, weekend in 2012. So earlier in the same year that ultimately The Shield made its debut. And it's this very amateurish video that somebody shot on their phone of Mick Foley. He's, walking through this hotel lobby and he's being greeted by fans. And all of a sudden, here comes Dean. We didn't know who he was at the time, but here's Dean Ambrose shows up. He was probably in FCW at the time. And he gets up in Foley's face. He's, going after Foley and saying that you're basically calling him like a murderer, and nobody knows what the hell he's talking about. And Foley is selling it great, it's just this fan who's trying to cause trouble, and everybody is like, you leave him alone. And they wanted to make it look and sound and feel real. And the video's up on YouTube if you've never seen it. And I remember thinking, oh, this is really good shit. Oh man, they're going to start an angle here. That's how they're going to introduce Ambrose to the main roster. He's going to feud with Mick Foley. The matches might be shit, but I was already digging kind of the vibes that I was getting from that first video. And the angle never worked out. They never really went farther with it because Foley couldn't get physically cleared. He couldn't get medically cleared, so they abandoned the whole idea. And looking back on it, he says it was the best thing that ever could have happened, the fact that angle fell through. Because, knowing now what he didn't know then, about how scripted and how micromanaged everything would have been, because he was all amped up. He's like, man, I got these promos I'm going to cut on Foley. It's going to be great. Once he realized, looking back, how scripted and how rigid everything was, he says what would have ended up happening most likely was he would have gotten heat for having an attitude and not wanting to play ball and not wanting to be a team player, and he would have been buried. And that would have been the end of him. Instead of what ended up happening, which is he got positioned as one of the top acts in the company, which he was with the Shield. So I think in the end it worked out to his advantage, and he thinks so too. He made a comment in the interview with Keller about how not all the writers are idiots. It's just that their jobs shouldn't exist, in his view. Their jobs should not exist in the first place. Not a big fan of writers. He said, if you're a talent and you don't know how to cut a promo on your own, his words, you're a fucking idiot. And that sounds harsh, but what he was trying to say is, it's fine to, if you're not a great promo, to stumble and stammer and whatever, but you need to be able to just keep doing it, and eventually you'll be doing it on your own. You should not have to rely on memorizing lines. And you know what? I agree with that 100%. I think he's right. At Double or Nothing, he gave this as an example of the difference right away. AEW's had one show so far, and already he's using this as an example of the differences to illustrate between the two companies. Double or Nothing. He goes to Cody before the show. He says, look, I got these ideas. When I do my thing and I'm going to go to the back, make sure you've got a camera following me right through the locker room, and I'm going to cut a promo. And Cody just goes, sure, sounds good. So they had a camera waiting, and it followed him into the locker room, and he cut a promo. And in fact, he did, I think, 1 or 2 more promos while he was in the back. He said that 10 minutes. It took 10 minutes. We did 3 promos already. That all turned out great. They had the idea that at the end of one of them, Joey Janela was going to walk into view and light up a cigarette. He would take the cigarette out of Janela's hand, smoke it, throw it on the ground, and that would be a little tease for their match at Fyter Fest later this month. This was a collaborative thing. It was simple, it was quick, and they pulled it off just fine, and that's the way it should be. That, to him, is one of the biggest differences already between WWE and AEW. He said if Steve Austin walked into WWE today in 2019, you don't have Austin 316, which is 100% true. I've said the same thing before. If The Rock walks in now, if Roddy Piper walks in, I mean, my God, if somebody looking the way that Dusty Rhodes used to look, if he walked in today to the company or comes to the main roster, he might be okay in NXT. He probably wouldn't even get a job in the first place. But they walk in, guys like that walk in or get called up. Most of them, maybe not all, maybe 1 or 2 sneak through, but I would wager that most of them never go on to have the kind of success, even close to the kind of success that they ended up having back in the 70s, 80s, 90s when they were first becoming big names. They had that because a lot of those guys like Dusty and Piper, they could work, they could wrestle, but what are they most known for? They're known for their promos. They're known for their ability to talk people into the buildings, to get them to hate them, to get them to love them. And they would be completely stifled if people like that were coming up in the system. Now think of all the guys that we've missed out on that we will never even know existed. We will never even know who they were, who they are, what their names are, that could have potentially come up in the last 5, 10, 15 years. Because the system is set up the way it is, it doesn't allow for people like that to really break through anymore. Very rarely. But I love how in both interviews, the one with Jericho and this one, he calls into question this notion that Vince McMahon is some kind of genius. He says that he was a genius in the 80s with Hulkamania and when he killed off the territories and got on cable TV. But in 2019, from his experiences in dealing with him, and this is in his words, Vince McMahon doesn't know what the fuck is going on. So he thinks that Vince either needs to figure it out or step aside and let somebody else who does know what's going on take the reins. There was another interview he did, the website one that I mentioned earlier with that random website where he used the Spider-Man analogy for Vince McMahon. He mentioned the Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire where Willem Dafoe was the bad guy. And they vote him out of his own company. And Moxley just wonders, why aren't the shareholders getting together and saying, this dude is laughing at his own fart jokes? We've got to get him out of here. Isn't there a way where we can all band together and squeeze him out? He says he went from creating modern wrestling to being the one that's hindering it the most. Now he figures that person is probably Triple H because who else is there? There is no one else. Was Stephanie going to take over? Oh my God. Oh my God. Shane, I mean, there's nobody else within the hierarchy there. It's Triple H by default. Triple H has been training for this and preparing for this for years now. He's been like Vince McMahon's apprentice. And Moxley said, look, let him take over for a month. Give Triple H a month and see what happens. Now, in the one of the interviews that he gave on the subject of Triple H, he says that it was a bad idea when Triple H started buying the indies. Those were his words. Every week, Triple H, he says, is taking an Instagram selfie with some indie guy. He doesn't know if he was doing this or if he does this to try to make himself look cool and get some indie cred or why he does it. He basically started buying the indies. Where are all these good ideas going to come from if you do that? He says if they signed Daniel Bryan at 21 years old, he never would have become Bryan Danielson. And you never would have had WrestleMania 30. If they signed CM Punk before he was really CM Punk, he never would have done what he did. If they signed me at 21, I never would have become anything good. I had to develop first before getting brought in. Buying up all of the indie scene was the same as Vince buying up all the territories back in the day. Soon, there's nobody left to cherry pick for talent. And he says that it's amazing that even though they bought the indie, he kept saying that, they bought the indies. Even though they bought the indies, he says that it's amazing that it has repopulated itself stronger than ever, which it has. The indie scene looks and feels as strong now as it has ever been. I want to point out Sound Off 374. In March of 2015, over 4 years ago, I did a segment on what I viewed as Triple H's long-term plan with NXT, which was to effectively kill off the independent scene, or at least neutralize it, control it. And I'm glad to see Moxley agree with that point of view. That plan is still in effect. Each time they open a new performance center in another country, which is smart, they should be doing that, but every time they open a new PC somewhere like they did recently in the UK, or they open up a new league, their own little promotion like NXT UK, they are muscling in on the different territories and trying to take them over one by one. It is a slow coup. They're trying to plant their flag in all of these different places in the world. And then, like with the UK talent, they might all be buddy-buddy at first, but they implement these rules about what is and isn't allowed in terms of where these guys can perform. You know, if this company has TV, you can't wrestle for them, you can't do this, you can't do that. And again, Ambrose apparently viewed it the same way that I did. He was talking about Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins in this interview with The Torch, and them having to deal with a lot of awful dialogue in their own promos. And he specifically singled out the infamous Sufferin' Succotash promo on SmackDown with Roman Reigns. Sufferin' Succotash, ah yes. Roman Reigns, for all the shit this guy gets, did not want to say that line. He did not want to say that line because he knew, he's no dummy, he knew how awful and corny it was. And you want an easy way to get people to turn on Roman Reigns, you give him awful, corny dialogue. You don't make him sound cool, you make him sound like a cartoon character. Vince McMahon insisted on it. This was back during the period where Vince McMahon suddenly, we heard these reports that Vince McMahon is now writing Roman's promos for him. He is personally having a hand in writing. He's personally involved in writing Roman Reigns' promos. And boy, did it show. I think the only thing missing was probably a Three Stooges reference. Maybe Abbott and Costello? Amos and Andy? Any other dated references I'm missing? Mr. Ed? Well, he's probably in the truck. But that, hey, what can we work in here? What other dated references can we work in here? And Roman was mortified. He was absolutely mortified. He went to Dean. He said, is there a cool way that I can actually say that? I like how he went to Dean Ambrose. He's like, I'll come to you. Is there a cool way that I could possibly say this line? As it turned out, the answer is no. There was no cool way to say Sufferin' Succotash on TV. And Roman, as if he wrote it himself, got a lot of backlash for it. And it did not help in terms of trying to get people to get behind Roman Reigns. He talked about the Brock Lesnar match as well in this interview at WrestleMania 32. And he touched on this in the interview he did with Steve Austin about how he was not happy with how that went. And he kind of, he gave a little more, he put a little more meat on the bone here in terms of all of these different ideas. He was so excited. He said, this was the most important match of my career. I wanted it to be perfect, and he didn't care. He figured Brock was going to go over. It wasn't about who's going to win, who's going to lose. He just wanted to go out there and have a great match, hard-hitting match that people would remember and would steal the show. And he said, the difference is that you have Undertaker and Shane McMahon on that same show going out later in the night and having a Hell in a Cell match, and they're taking bumps and Shane is falling off the top of the cage. He says, those guys were trying to steal the show. Brock Lesnar does not give a shit about trying to steal the show. And he had all of these ideas, and he would talk, when Brock was actually there, he would try to talk to him, and Brock was always like, don't worry about it, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it, don't worry about it. Didn't show any interest in hearing about any of the ideas that Ambrose had for this match. On top of that, in the build, there was that one segment on Raw where he came out, Ambrose did, with a little red wagon that he was stockpiling with weapons. A little red wagon. He saw that in the script. He couldn't believe it. Like Roman with the suffering Sakate. He was mortified when he saw that. And he tried to fight against it, and in the end it didn't work. So Vince sent him out there with a little red wagon. So he wasn't thrilled with the build-up to the match. They did the thing with Terry Funk, gave him like a barbed wire bat to use, which of course never really came into play much. But he had these ideas. He went to Vince and said, he texted Vince, I want to do a thumbtack bump spot. Can we do thumbtacks? Like, Brock's not going to go through them, obviously, but I'll go through them. And he said Vince texted back maybe with like a smiley face. And he took that to mean, oh, I'm going to get to do the thumbtack bump spot. Of course, in the end, no thumbtacks. There was no thumbtack bump. They did a whole spot where they did the pile of chairs that Brock F5'd him on the chairs. But like the day of WrestleMania, the day of the show, he can't find Brock. They have rehearsals for WrestleMania every year. Brock didn't even show up until 3 o'clock. They said the pre-show was starting at 5. So he has not talked to Brock Lesnar at all about their match. They haven't gone over the finish. They haven't talked about anything. But he still has all of these ideas. He had this idea where the bell would ring and he would mace Brock in the face right away. So now Brock is blinded and he can start hitting him with weapons and stuff. And it was like an hour before the show. And Brock's like, actually, you know what? That's kind of a good idea. And he's like, we could have talked about this weeks ago. So now they're scrambling to go to the prop person. We have to come up with a way to do the mace. And I don't know, to me, I guess, look, if you just put water in a fucking bottle and spray it, you can call it mace. I mean, does mace look I've never been maced, so I don't know. But maybe it has a particular color to it or something. Because he said they tried it and it didn't look good. It didn't look real, and so they had to abandon it. And he was pissed. Because had they talked about this weeks in advance, they could have had plenty of time to have a prop person put together a bottle that looked like he was actually macing Brock Lesnar. So they couldn't do that. All of these ideas. And that match was very lame. I remember that match being one of the more disappointing ones that I had high hopes for on that card. But Brock just wasn't willing. He wasn't willing to do anything. He wanted to do the bare minimum. We'll go out there, we'll do suplex, we'll do, I'll sell a little bit, put the chairs in the ring, F5, boom, we're done. So it was you listen to him tell that story and it was very frustrating because he did have all of these ideas and just nobody gave a shit. He wanted that match to be memorable. He wanted to steal the show. You need two to tango. The other guy didn't give a shit. He didn't care. He didn't want to do it. Then he talked about the Stone Cold podcast. And this was the one thing when I was done listening to the Jericho interview, I said, I wish Jericho would have asked him about that. Well, Keller did in the interview that he did with Ambrose. And he said, what was up with that? Because I look back at that Stone Cold podcast on the network and people think I'm exaggerating, but I look at that as the beginning of the end for this guy. He was the WWE champion at the time, and he was made to look like a jabron. Not on purpose, but he just did not come across well at all. And then Austin made that comment about, I think you're resting. It kind of seems like you're resting on your laurels. And I just remember they showed Ambrose's face, and Ambrose looked like he wanted to strangle Austin. Like he was completely stunned, no pun intended. He was stunned when Austin said that to him. And they're on live TV, and he doesn't know how to respond because he wasn't expecting that. It was an embarrassment. And so he explains, he said, I really was looking forward. I don't hate Steve. I love Steve. And he says, hey, now that I'm free, by the way, Steve, call me. I'll do a podcast interview with you again. But he said he was really amped up and looking forward to it. And a week in advance, one of the WWE producers called him. And they wanted to go over some things in terms of questions and stuff. And they wanted some background information on his family life, his personal life. And he did not want to talk about that. He made it very clear, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to discuss that. That's off limits. So the first thing Austin asks him a week later when they do the interview is about his family. And once that happened, he sort of shut down. Because he was so pissed, not at Steve, not at Austin, but he was pissed at the producer. He felt the producer had misled him. He made it very clear he did not want to talk about that stuff. He's very uncomfortable talking about that stuff. And Austin, right out of the gate, asked him about his family life, And I'm not of the impression that like his family life was awful or anything like that. He didn't say like he came from a broken home. Maybe he did. I don't know. But it was just, he just was uncomfortable. He didn't want to talk about that. And as soon as Austin brought it up, that was it. Like he shut down. He was very awkward, and the interview just completely went off the rails. And then Austin brought up stuff about going off script. Not necessarily listening to everything you're told. You're the champion, you're a top guy, going off script. I used to go off script and got to be more assertive. And Ambrose was the WWE champion at the time. He was, the top guy. I mean, maybe he really wasn't. I think Roman's always been the top guy, but he was the champ. And he felt, I'm representing the locker room. I'm representing my generation sitting here, not Steve's generation. There's a whole bunch of guys my age in that locker room. I'm here representing them. I'm the champion. And he said he and a lot of other guys in that locker room felt at the time the same way. He wanted to say, hey, Steve, I agree with you. You're absolutely right, 100%. But he couldn't. Because he wasn't in a position to say what he wanted to without burying the company. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place. And that's why I've said all these years, ever since I saw the interview, that was really a shitty thing for Austin to do. And I don't think he was not trying to do that on purpose or be malicious. But that was on Austin. You don't bring something like that up unless you talk to the guy first in advance and at least give him a heads up. Or when the interview's over, pull him aside and say, hey, dude, listen, and then you can have a private conversation about it. But to put him on the spot like that, and all eyes are on him, Vince is probably standing off camera watching all this. It was an impossible position for him to be in. It was not fair to him. So that interview was just a total, and he admits it, that interview is just a complete and total disaster. But no hard feelings. He would love to go back on Austin's show. Austin's podcast is coming back, I saw in a few weeks. It's been on hiatus for a while. So maybe we'll get another Moxley sit down with Stone Cold. So that pretty much, that wraps up all the really kind of what I found to be most interesting stuff in terms of the interviews that Moxley gave this week. A lot of good shit. And I know, again, a lot of people are going to look at it and go, it's just sour grapes, he's just bitching, blah, blah, blah. And these are the same people that will just defend everything WWE does to their death. They'll turn a blind eye to all the shit. Everything's fine. That gif with the dog sitting and sipping the coffee with the flames. Everything's fine. This is fine. That's what those people are doing. They're enabling this. I don't want this company to think that we love the product that they're putting out, because if we don't, they should know that people, they're not really digging what you're doing. Maybe you should try something different. Staying silent on it, or me not covering it anymore and just deciding to ignore it, doesn't help any fucking thing. So I'm happy when I hear people like him come out and tell the truth. I want more people, when their contracts are up, to do shoot interviews and just bury the fuck out of this company. I think we need more of that. But it really helps when you have somebody as high up in the food chain as Moxley was. He was a member of The Shield. Hell, WWE once went on Instagram and claimed The Shield was the #1 greatest faction of all time. Which was a whole other fucking segment I did on that. But anyway, really good stuff. And I said before, refreshing to hear, but also very depressing.